About 2 years ago, I moved into my newly built home in Australia. I was one of the first people to complete construction in the area. My only focus was finally having a place of my own, a space where I could live independently. The first few weeks were normal. The neighborhood was still developing, with only a handful of houses scattered around. Every afternoon, I took my dog for a walk, exploring the surrounding properties and open fields. The roads were nearly complete, paved with signs marking the owners of each plot. However, the only occupied houses were mine and one directly across from me. That house was fully built but lacked a private driveway, meaning no one had moved in yet. To the left of my home, a few hundred meters away, stood a field of crops and a tall farmhouse. My house felt somewhat isolated, given how new the area was. A few kilometers beyond, in the open landscape, there was an old rural house, abandoned, weathered, and standing completely alone. Something about it unsettled me, yet I couldn't shake my curiosity. One day, I decided to take my dog for a walk and get a closer look. I couldn't explain why, but I had a strange feeling that something about that house wasn't right. Then, about a month or two after moving in, I woke up to the sound of a violin playing. At first, I found it soothing and assumed it was coming from the house across the street. Maybe the owners had finally moved in. Excited by the thought of new neighbors, I pulled back the curtain and looked outside, but the house remained empty. Confused, I got out of bed and dressed quickly. Yet as I washed my face and got ready for the day, the music suddenly stopped. It had been the very thing that woke me, and now it had vanished, without a trace. At first, I ignored it, but as the days passed, my curiosity grew. Then, one morning, as soon as I heard the violin again, I ran straight to the door and opened it. The music always started just before sunrise, in the dim, early morning darkness. Stepping outside, I scanned my surroundings. Then, my eyes locked onto the top of the hill to the left of my house. There, silhouetted against the pale morning light, stood a figure playing the violin. His features were unclear, but he was tall. As he played, he spun in slow circles, almost as if he were dancing. For a moment, I just watched. Then, I briefly looked away to grab my morning newspaper. It took only 10 seconds. But when I glanced back at the hill, the music had stopped. The figure had stopped too. He was no longer playing, no longer moving, just standing there, still, silent. The darkness made it impossible to see his face, but I knew he was looking at me. We both stood frozen for nearly half a minute, locked in an eerie, unmoving stare. A cold fear crept up my spine. I instinctively stepped back, then quickly shut the door behind me. After that morning, strange things started happening. While walking my dog, I noticed footprints inside my property. Footprints that weren't mine. At first, I dismissed them, assuming someone had wandered through, but the next morning, I didn't wake up to the sound of the violin. I woke up to something far worse. Footsteps, right outside my window. I held my breath, my heart hammering against my ribs. Slowly, I turned my head toward the glass, but when I looked outside, there was no one there. Also, other strange things started happening to me. When I went to work, I started receiving calls from unknown numbers. As soon as I answered and put the receiver to my ear, the line would immediately cut off. After that, I stopped walking around the countryside near our area, and of course, I stopped because of the terrifying violin player I had seen before. A few nights later, after turning off the TV in the living room, I went to my room and stretched out on my bed to sleep. Suddenly, I heard the sound of a violin playing. It was very quiet. I froze in place as a chill ran through my entire body. The time I heard this playing was in the middle of the night, which was unusual, as I normally heard it in the morning. I went to the front window and looked outside. That's when I saw a light in the house, opposite mine. It was clear that this light wasn't electric, but a candle, because it was very dim. The music wasn't coming from a violin or a live player, but from a recorded music device. I remained standing there, watching the house for 10 minutes, but I saw no movement inside. So, I moved away from the window, truly frightened. 5 minutes passed, and the music continued playing. I left my screen on and used my headphones, trying to distract myself. Later that night, feeling hungry, I decided to go to the kitchen to get something from the fridge. Silence filled the house, with only the sound from my headphones breaking it. I grabbed something from the fridge, then turned around. That's when I saw it. A dim light was coming from the office window. At this time of night, I had no idea what could be causing it. I slowly started walking toward the office window, getting so close that my nose almost touched the glass. That's when I realized the horrifying truth. Those weren't lights. They were eyes. 2 glowing eyes just above my fence, staring straight at me. I didn't blink. I didn't move. I simply stood there, frozen in place, unable to process what I was seeing. My mind screamed at me to react, but my body refused to obey. Then, all at once, my strength gave out. I collapsed to the ground. Panicking, I crawled away from the window and pressed my back against the wall. My heartbeat was deafening, pounding like a drum in my ears. My mind was still struggling to comprehend the danger I was facing. And then, the violin started playing again, that eerie, cursed melody. But this time, the sound wasn't coming from the distance. It was coming from right outside my window. The room was dark, but I knew he was there. I wanted to turn off my screen so he wouldn't see me, but my body wouldn't cooperate. The violin's tune wasn't like before. It was distorted, unnatural. Then, my dog, who was outside in the garden, began barking furiously. The violin playing stopped immediately. A dead silence filled the house. The only sound I could hear was the faint hum from my headphones. I remained frozen in place, barely breathing. Then, my dog barked again. And that's when I heard them. Footsteps. Someone was walking toward the backyard, toward my dog. The moment I realized this, fear tightened its grip on me. But I couldn't just sit there. I forced myself to move, rushing to the back door. When I got there, I saw my dog standing still, staring into the garden. Slowly, I opened the door. Usually, when I open the door, my dog immediately understands that he's allowed to enter and comes inside without hesitation. But this time, when I opened the door, he remained standing in place, completely still, as if everything around me was warning me not to step outside. Yet, I couldn't leave him there. I stepped out, stood behind him, slipped my hand into his collar and gently tried to pull him inside. My dog was a Labrador, and his weight was somewhat heavy. So, when he didn't want to move, it took a lot of energy and effort from me to pull him from his spot. Now, at this critical moment, he didn't want to move. I tried to pull him forcefully by his collar, and suddenly he started barking in a voice I had never heard before. The sound of the barking was very strange, as if it was saying, "Damn you! Go away!" This barking raised my tension to the highest level. My dog and I remained standing without moving. I don't remember how long we stayed like that, without moving or reacting. Eventually, I heard the sound of footsteps outside the house fence. The footsteps seemed to indicate that the person was moving away, and they didn't disappear. It was as if the dog regained consciousness, raised his eyes, and looked at me. Then he turned and entered the house. I followed him immediately, closed the door, took him, and went directly to my bed. I covered myself and him, and didn't close my eyes at all. I stayed up until morning. That night was the last time I saw and heard the violin player. The next morning, when the sun rose, I called my manager and told him that I wanted a day off because I was sick. Immediately after, I called the police. The police arrived, and they started rummaging around my house. They entered and found footprints in the dirt, but didn't find anything or any evidence that could lead them to the person. All they found were the footprints. The only description I could give to the police officer was his height. I told them that he was very tall, to the point where he'd stand and look at me over the fence. They told me that he might have left something inside and suggested looking at it. They also told me that they hadn't received any reports or notifications about someone playing the violin in the area and hadn't seen anyone playing or dancing on the hill. I felt like I was literally going crazy, but the police officer was very kind and offered to have patrols around my house the next few nights to help me relax a bit. Nothing strange happened during that time. After about a year or two, people started coming to the area and haunting it, and the number of houses increased. Most of them were told the story of the strange entity or person I used to see, so they used this story to scare their children. One of them even named the piece of land with the hill Violin Hill. Of course, I still live in my house, live in peace,